episode of The Exchange, I speak to Professor Michael Stambolis about the history of coming out, and Jules Guaitamacchi discusses why coming out can be a lifelong process. Jules, it's great to see you again.
Yeah, really lovely to see you. Really good.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Exchange. We're going to be talking a bit about coming out. And obviously coming out might mean different things to different people, and people have loads of different experiences of it. Can you just tell us a bit about your own story?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, coming out's a bit of a funny subject for me, I guess, because I've had to come out quite a few times in my life. And it first started around my sexuality when I was much younger, and then later on again with my gender identity. So I've come out twice in my life, and both times have been really different in themselves, really. I think the first time when I kind of recognized the fact that I wasn't straight, and I had to communicate that to my family, I was much younger. So I think that the experience of that was in a way a lot harder, and it was also a long time ago, where there weren't that many people who were out and gay. But eventually, I think it took me a number of years to actually get comfortable with them myself, and be able to tell the people around me. And I was almost in and out of the closet, because depending on various friendship groups, you know, it was always dependent on the people around me, how comfortable I felt to actually be myself. And there were moments in my life where I felt more comfortable with some friendship groups and less comfortable with others. But, you know, that kind of over the years, as I explored that, I recognized that even that didn't sit quite comfortably with me. And actually there was an issue much deeper within me that I wasn't facing, or I hadn't really acknowledged. And that's when I came out for a second time with regards to my gender identity. But that didn't happen until I was 30, so a lot later on in life. Coming out as non-binary was its own kind of experience, and it was a very complex experience, because there's not that much awareness, there's not much understanding, and I had to come about that myself. I had to really feel my way through the experience and kind of follow my way through the journey quite slowly, I guess. And I'm still following that journey. I'm still unsure, you know, in many ways.
Michael, it is lovely to have you on this episode of The Exchange.
It's really my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
A lot of us may think that we know what coming out means, but I know it's evolved over time and means different things to different communities. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means to you?
Today, we sort of almost take it for granted that the expression to come out or coming out means what it means. The idea that you would reveal most typically your sexual orientation to people who don't know it. But in reality, the expression itself, coming out, has evolved over time, in particular over the 20th century, to come to mean different things in different places. Before coming out was used to describe sexual identity, it was actually used to describe young women coming out into high society during events that were known as debutante balls. 20th century, the expression moved out of coming out as a debutante into the more private sphere of the drag and sort of nightlife scene, gay nightlife scene in the mid-20th century. And in that case, coming out was quite similar to coming out as a debutante. In this case, it would be gay people, particularly gay men, who would come out to other people in the gay community saying, I'm one of you. Now, coming out means, in general, to reveal something about yourself that is socially stigmatized, often something that's invisible.
That's really helpful, actually, just to get a bit of a broader understanding. Can you just explain to us why this has been such an important part of the LGBT rights movement?
Sexuality is typically something, particularly when it's a minority sexual identity, like being gay or lesbian or bisexual, that's not something you're going to share with people in your family. LGBTQ plus people have traditionally needed to rely on solidarity from outside their family networks. And an important part of coming out is that it helps you, once you reveal it to someone else who shares that status, you have that in common and you can create a kind of bond. But more importantly, coming out became very important as a social movement strategy to create change, so that people, so that being gay or bisexual or trans, would be less stigmatized. But in order to create change, the leaders of LGBT organizations felt that it was important that people be aware that that they have gay neighbors, that they have trans coworkers. And so coming out is the idea of sharing that part of yourself with other people so that it's not invisible.
Obviously, unfortunately, not everyone meets with acceptance when they do come out. And many people will actually feel afraid to do so. Why is it important that nobody feels forced or pressured into coming out before they're ready?
I think it's so important that you ask this question. I think it's a really, really important thing to highlight because I often talk about this when I'm public speaking, that we should never pressure anybody to come out. Firstly, the other person doesn't know exactly what that person is experiencing. So even if it's a hunch or just something that they think about the person, it's not appropriate to just decide that that's what that person is going through. And holding space is much more important, to just let that person in their own time go through their own journey and their own process. Because each and every one of us, we have a different family dynamic, we have different history. So I guess coming out is much harder for some people than it is for others, and pushing them into something that they might not be ready for. And they might be too vulnerable or be in a situation that they might not be ready to experience.
When you talk about holding space, what does that look like as someone who's an ally, do you think?
So holding space is very much about listening to the other person, I feel, and allowing the other person to communicate with you, making it a safe environment for them to do so, being non-judgmental and open-minded, making sure that, you're a supportive person, and just kind of giving across that energy. And it doesn't require very much, actually. I think it takes more energy and effort to be the person that's like trying to dictate someone's life and be controlling. You're being a nice and supportive person, essentially.
And what are some of the misconceptions around coming out? And are there any problems with the phrase itself?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Coming out is not an event. Coming out is many different events. So there's lots of interesting research that looks at how coming out is a constant process. If we're thinking about sexual orientation or gender identity, it's something that's often invisible. So people who you interact with will not, if you've never met them before, won't necessarily know. And in a society like ours, it is assumed that if you do not tell people your sexual identity, for example, then you're straight. Coming out is something you have to do every time. So I'll give you some examples to make this a little bit clearer. So I'm gay, and usually when I teach, I tell my students that I'm gay. And in a way that's coming out, because when I'm teaching in a lecture hall with 700 undergraduates in their first year in the English program here in France, they don't know me, but I'm not necessarily sure that they know I'm gay. And I choose to tell them, often because I'll just talk about my husband the way one of my straight colleagues might. And I do that because I think it's important for students to have the sense that, wow, this professor can be gay and say it and it's not a big deal. On the other hand, when I go and get my hair cut for the first time at a salon that I've never been to before, and the person who's cutting my hair asks me how my wife is, just assuming that I have one, I really have to think about whether or not it's worth my time to correct that person. And sometimes it's not. And also sometimes I don't feel safe, right? Maybe if I'm in an event where I don't know anybody and I don't feel confident that it's okay to say that I'm gay, then I'm not going to. But that doesn't make me a bad gay guy, and it doesn't mean that I'm being irresponsible. It means that I'm thinking strategically about what's right for me. And I think it's important for people to be cognizant of that people will make choices and that those choices should be respected.
I think that's really important that you mentioned that. I think not everyone may feel comfortable about coming out at a particular time, and it's important that everyone does it, I think, in their own time and in their own way. What are some of the benefits, though, of perhaps coming out psychologically and perhaps socially?
I definitely would not be one to speak to each person's case because everybody is individual in their circumstances. But sometimes we can think that it's really scary and that we're going to tell people and they might love us less, or that the reaction will be quite negative, and sometimes we're very pleasantly surprised. And so it can feel really a relief in those circumstances, because you realize that people love you for who you are, regardless of what it is that you may be. Socially, the benefits can be very interesting because it means that you are able to find other people like you. And as we were saying earlier, it helps you find forms of solidarity. You can find organizations to be involved in. It can also just help you feel more keyed in to what's going on, if you feel like it's something you don't have to hide. But as again, sometimes people choose not to come out for strategic reasons, and that makes perfect sense.
Obviously, you go into a lot of schools and workplaces to talk to LGBTQIA plus people. How are things different now to when you were a teenager?
Oh, they're so different now. I mean, firstly, I'm showing my age now. Firstly, it was illegal to promote, educate, teach, have any literature of any kind that promoted the LGBTQIA plus community. We didn't have social media. There weren't very many resources, and there weren't very many forms of point of references from which to kind of learn about myself. And I actually started my public speaking career really focusing more on mental health topics than I did necessarily the LGBTQ plus community and this topic. And as I navigated my own journey, and I would incorporate my experience around my sexual orientation, but as I kind of went through my gender identity journey, that's when I really started to focus and really started to realize that more needs to be focused specifically on this topic within our schools, because all of a sudden, as I started to touch on the subject, I every school that I was going into, there were young people that were either transitioning or coming out or battling with their sexual orientation. And that was something that I didn't really see in the early days. We see more of it today. We're seeing more young people coming out, which is great. But it does mean that more people are speaking up, and it means that we've got little support, and there needs to be more. And we see, as a result, I believe, a lot more discrimination as a result of that. Because I was in the closet, up until almost my late teens, early 20s. And, yes, it's a safer place being in the closet, but it's also a very miserable and very painful place to be in. And it causes huge issues with mental health. And so it's important that we support our young people sooner. But there are huge differences today, societally, I think, in amongst our youth, which is really positive. But now we need to be able to sort of manage that.
I also think the fact that social media, as you said, it's such a great platform for just showing role models. Why do you think it's so important that there are really visible role models in the community?
Oh, it's so important. There are so many role models and people that I look up to and who have helped me through this journey that I recognize just how important that is for other people. And we demonize social media, and I understand that. I completely understand that we a lot of us do misuse it. There's this whole kind of way of using it where we mispresent our own lives, and we maybe get stuck in that kind of false projection of the way that things are. But actually it can be used in a really positive light, and by which to kind of communicate your experiences, connect with one another. And actually I found it to be such a useful tool when it comes to really connecting with my community, because many of us are actually dotted around all over the world, and it's really beautiful to have these platforms to connect with each other, to inspire one another, and also to look at the people that are out there doing things, that are being part of this world.
I love social media for that. I think it's such a powerful tool. All of us, I'm sure, over the course of our lives are going to know people and meet people who are queer, trans, non-binary. What are some of the ways that we can support friends or family members who come out to us?
As I said earlier, it's all about being non-judgmental and open-minded as much as you can be, recognizing that just because you don't relate to something personally, that's okay. We don't all need to relate to one another. We are all different, and we need to respect those people and those experiences. I still sometimes experience a bit of discord within our own community, where people say, well, that's not my experience. That's not how to be non-binary. And I just think that, there is no right or wrong way. We all experience our gender identity, our sexual orientation, our lives, who we are differently. We all have different experiences. And I think it's about respecting that. It's about hearing that, and it's about supporting as much as we can, without, recognizing we can't rescue anybody, but we can be there with open arms.
Jules, that is so helpful, and you've just spoken so clearly. Thanks for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thank you so much. Take lots of care.